So I'm happy to introduce Richard. So Richard received his BSc and MPhil degrees in computer science from the Chinese University of Hong Kong in 2002 and 2004 respectively, and the PhD degree in electrical engineering from Columbia University in 2010. During his PhD study, he interned at IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center and Telefonica Research Barcelona. He's currently associate professor with the Department of Computer Science, NUS. His current research interests include cloud computing, distributed systems, and network economics. He was a recipient of the Best Paper runner-ups from the ACM MobiHawk 2020 and a co-recipient of the Best Paper Award in the IEEE IC2E 2013, the IEEE ICNP 2014, and the IEEE Workshop on Smart Data Pricing 2015. He's a senior member of the ACM and IEEE, and so he is a pioneer of internet economics, and I think we are all very happy to hear what he has to say about that today. So Richard.
Thank you so much, Wissam, for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. I think I want to thank you, Kudeep. So yeah, it's my great pleasure to have this chance to share my recent research with colleagues and friends, although not in a face-to-face setting. Today, I'm going to talk about internet transport economics. So given the broad background of the audience, I was wondering, what am I going to start with? I thought maybe I'm going to start with something simple and fundamental like this, or something a little bit more complicated like this. So I'm not sure, but maybe some of you have guessed. It's about this. So actually, it is a Korean drama series called Squid Game, produced by Netflix just a couple of months ago. Okay, so why is this such a big deal? First, let's look who Netflix is. So you may know that Netflix is a video streaming provider since it also sells services in Singapore. But you might not know that over 1/3 of the internet traffic actually is produced by Netflix itself during the peak hours. Okay, so as the entire internet is becoming more and more content-centric, and if we talk about content providers, then Netflix is indeed a big deal. Okay, so then how about this this drama? So actually, as this drama becoming so popular, it attracted a lot of traffic demand from the residential users in South Korea. And recently, the South Korean internet service provider, SK Broadband, has sued Netflix for like $23 million pay for the costs from increased network traffic and maintenance. Okay, so what attracted my attention was also the side remark shown here. It says that in the United States, Netflix has been paying a fee to broadband provider Comcast for over 7 years. Actually, this is something I knew. Obviously, now SK Broadband also want to get a share of the profits generated by Netflix. But of course, Netflix doesn't want to pay, and this is shown from recent news. Although, and Netflix even threatens that it might stop the service and quit the Korean market. But at this moment, we don't know what's going to happen. But we do know that even the Netflix Comcast deal was not settled in an easy way. Okay, so indeed, like 7 years ago in January 2014, the download speed of users of Netflix behind the access provider Comcast was found to be dropped by 25%. So this was just before that Netflix agreed to pay Comcast for direct connection and the higher capacity, after which we can see the speed gets back to normal and even much higher. Okay, but at that time, Netflix blamed that it was Comcast who intentionally throttled the network traffic and argued that based on the so-called net neutrality principles, Comcast should not be allowed to charge content providers like Netflix for better service and quality. But on the other hand, Comcast said that it was Netflix who intentionally sending much higher volume of traffic than the capacity can handle. Okay, so although at that time the regulator, the US FCC, was trying to push for its net neutrality regulations, but it still decided to exempt this peering relationship from its open internet order at that time. So it does allow the ISPs to charge differently for different qualities. And this is because the regulator felt that it lacks in-depth knowledge in the internet traffic exchange context. Okay, so actually this inspired my earlier research, including this research, because in order to understand these kind of peering disputes and eventually resolve them, the key is to really understand the policy implications of the strategic behaviors about these ISPs and content providers, and eventually how they're going to affect the performance, or sometimes we call the quality of service of the applications. All right. So the key question is, how can we first characterize the quality of service of internet applications? Okay. Although it took quite a long time for me to figure it out, but here's some kind of initial result I want to share with you. So to me, it's a quite challenging question or problem, because the QoS is influenced first by the kind of protocols used by the application. For example, whether the application is using UDP or TCP, what kind of congestion control algorithms are used by the version of the TCP, so on and so forth. Of course, it really depends on the physical capacities of the communication or network links along the routing path. And it also depends on other competing cross traffic that are sharing certain resources along the routing path. But fundamentally, these are determined again by the complex business relationships and decisions of the so-called autonomous systems. For example, their capacity planning decisions, their routing decisions, and the peering agreements among them. Okay. So today I'm gonna introduce a kind of new approach, which I called the internet transport economics, to characterize the QoS of internet applications. So what I'm going to do is first try to give you some background about the internet. What is the internet from different perspectives of the internet? And then I'm going to discuss what is internet transport. In particular, what is the transport layer and the corresponding service. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about transport economics, how the traditional transport economics can be compared with the internet transport economics. And eventually, I'm going to introduce some new models and some new analytical results from the models. So please feel free to stop me if you have any questions, so that we can discuss a little bit. So about what is the internet. From a macroscopic view, we can view the internet as a huge network, which actually is a network of networks. So it consists of around 50,000 of these so-called autonomous systems, each of which itself is a large network. Okay, so as for this figure shows, each node here actually is an autonomous system. If we zoom in into the individual autonomous system, each big network could look like this, right? It consists of many end hosts and routers and switches. Okay, so under the internet paradigm, it uses this so-called packet switching paradigm to exchange data packets so as to enable end-to-end communications between any pair of the hosts. Okay, so this looks again quite complicated, right? Then if we further zoom into the individual network entities, then we'll find that all these networking functionalities are abstracted as a layer, as a layered model. Okay, so regardless of which particular layered model we're referring to, they are abstracted as layers of functionalities are abstracted in layers. And they are implemented actually by a stack of so-called network protocols. Among all these layers, this one particular layer I'm interested in. This is the transport layer, right? Because as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about internet transport economics, and obviously it's related to this layer. So why it is so special? Actually, this layer provides the host-to-host communication services for the upper layer applications. So since our objective is to characterize the quality of service for these applications, and from here we understand that it really depends on the underlying transport layer service, right, that supports the end-to-end communications. So this is the so-called vertical view I draw here, but we also have an end-to-end, which is a kind of horizontal view. So here we show along a typical routing path where a client try to download maybe certain data from a server. The data traverses along certain routing paths. Okay, so from here again, we can see this transport layer plays a very special role. Here, I want to say that it separates what we call the network edges. These are the end hosts, right? Could be a server or the client, right? That implements the full stack versus the network core, which do not implement the transport layer. However, we understand this transport layer service actually is enabled by the lower layer functionalities implemented in the network core as well. Okay, so now we've understood what is internet transport layer and its services, through which we can form a new perspective, which is, I call it a two-sided market view of the internet. Okay, so under this view, we can regard the entire internet infrastructure provided by the set of network providers, such as the broadband provider or wireless providers. These are typically ISPs, or it can be even a content distribution network, also called CDN providers. Okay, so we can regard these kind of infrastructure as a platform which connects the content providers like Netflix with their users, and create a so-called internet e-commerce ecosystems where the traditional business and economic dynamics applies. Okay, so typical examples of two-sided markets include, for example, credit card companies where which connects car holding consumers with merchants. And another example is video game platforms such as Xbox and the PlayStations that connects game developers and producers with game players. Okay, so under our context, what we are interested in is actually the underlying internet transport ecosystems. This is the topic we're gonna study. And in particular, I would like to introduce a new approach that I call it internet transport economics. So one way to kind of understand what it is that we treat the internet infrastructure as a transport system and try to study the economics of it. Okay, but another way to think about it is that it's a kind of transport economics that we want to study and understand, not in the traditional sense, but under the context of the internet. But the question might be, what is transport economics? So I want to talk a little bit. So when we talk about transport economics, so this is maybe a more familiar context, right? Without sufficient resources like road capacity, and without good regulations, pricing structures, and during peak hours, we might experience very long delays that affects our daily lives, right? But with good pricing structure, sufficient resource, then it doesn't have to be so congested. So this is a more familiar environment for us, okay? So what is transport economics? So transport economics actually is the study of movement of people and goods over space and the time. Okay, so actually the subjects generally deal with the resource allocation within the transportation sector. So examples including understanding the congestion and the role of road pricing, understanding the organization of public transportation services, and maybe try to explain the rise of low-cost even airlines, right? Think about the internet. Congestion, of course, is also a concern, okay? Maybe we should also try to learn how we could impose pricing in that context, right? And also as the regulators, how can we allocate maybe network resources in different geographical regions, so on and so forth. And maybe it could also be used to explain new phenomena. For example, the rise of content delivery networks, CDNs. So today, for our purposes, I'm trying to compare and contrast these two different transportation systems. Okay, so to me, they are quite similar in the sense that on the right-hand side, we can see these packets are pretty much like the vehicles on the highways, right? And communication lanes are pretty much like the roads here. And the routers and the switchers plays a role as the interchange points. Okay, so again, here the similarity again further extend to congestion, right? When we know when the system becomes more congested, it's going to induce higher latency and delay for the vehicles as well as for the data packets. But I want to say these two systems have major differences, so that it's quite challenging for us to directly borrow the models from the traditional transport economics in our context and use the existing results to understand many things. So first, because the subjects learns different things. for the internet, we're going to try to learn the movement instead of just vehicles. We have to understand the movement of streams of packets, not a single packet, but streams of packets. And typically we call them packet flows, right? Because these are the packet, it is the packet flows that creates the information services by the network applications. So this is a different, the key difference here. So then if we do a further comparison, we know that in the physical road systems, these vehicles never disappear, right? They might break down, but they never disappear. But in the internet, these data packets very often, they might got dropped, and the sender might detect that and resend a new packet. So that's very different. And in the road systems, for each vehicle, they have their own individual goals and the destinations. So they make their autonomous decisions or independent decisions about which road to take. So this is the kind of routing decisions. But in the context of the internet, it is actually the autonomous systems, these networks, that makes the corresponding interconnection and the routing decisions. While each packet does not make many decisions, they actually belong to a packet flow, which again belongs to certain network application running on top of this entire transportation system. So the physics are kind of different as well. So nevertheless, we're gonna take an economics approach. So here I wanna introduce some very fundamental concept from economics, which is market equilibrium. So for any commodity, for example, apple, so the fruit or your cell phone, right? Based on the market price, it drives both the demand and supply. And typically when the price increases and the demand drops, but on the other hand, the supply will increase, okay? So under a so-called equilibrium, that the demand and supply will be balanced, under which it determines the quantity of the commodity that will be produced and consumed by the demand side. And we can derive the corresponding market price for the commodity. Okay, so then the question becomes, okay, thinking about the internet, if we want to apply these kind of fundamental concepts, then what is actually the commodity that is actually produced and consumed, right? And correspondingly, what are the demand and the supply for that kind of commodity? And eventually, for the internet, what constitutes an equilibrium, right? So through which we can understand the steady state of the system, under which we can understand the quality of service for network applications. Okay, so I just want to put these questions here for you to consider. But if you have any idea, maybe we can discuss a little bit now before I give my answers. So maybe now we can imagine maybe the commodity is not really any physical commodity that is generated or consumed. Maybe there is. These are the data packets or the bits, right? But eventually later we will understand that it's not a physical commodity, but actually is a kind of service, which is the transport service provided by the transport layer. Oh, I forgot to mention, actually this transport layer is indeed where the TCP protocol resides, okay? Later I'm gonna give you my answer to this question, but first let me start with the building block of the transport system model. Okay, so we start with a general network resource denoted by K, and we denote the capacity of the resources by mu K, which means that the resource can process mu K packets per unit time. Okay, so depending on the modeling granularity, this resource can be as small as a physical communication link or as large as an autonomous system. Okay, so given any input rate denoted by lambda K, it induces certain average delay for the packets dk and a gain factor denoted by gk. So we assume that these two performance metrics, delay and gain, can be measured as functions of the capacity mu k and the input rate lambda k. So here we just make very mild monotonicity assumptions on these two functions, such as that the delay will be non-decreasing with the input rate, because generally we expect that with a higher load, each packet will experience higher delay in general. Okay, so here the gain factor actually captures the percentage of packet that went through this resource. So correspondingly, the so-called loss rate or drop rate is simply 1 minus GK. And we can simply calculate the throughput as the product of the gain multiplied by the input rate. Okay, so this is our fundamental building block for network resources. So the next step is that we can concatenate a series of such network resources forming or along a network routing path. Okay, here we call such a routing path a route denoted by L, which is just a set of resources. So naturally, we can understand that the end-to-end delay and the end-to-end gain is naturally additive and multiplicative in terms of the individual components at the resource level. Okay, so naturally, and again, these end-to-end performance metrics in terms of delay and gain actually determines the sending rate of packet flows that utilizes these routes. So as an example, the following shows a famous formula called PFTK formula that characterizes the sending rate of an active TCP Reno flow as follows. So here, 2D measures the so-called round trip time, and 1 minus G actually measures the end-to-end drop rate or loss rate. So
question.
Yes.
So I didn't get what is the intuition for the gain. So what does gain represent? I see what does the delay represent, but for the gain.
The gain is the percentage of packets that go through the resource. So
okay.
1 minus that percentage is the loss rate.
Okay, so that's the throughput is.
Throughput is simply this gaining factor multiplied by the input rate.
Okay,
so that's
cool.
the percentage of input that gets through. That's the throughput.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for the question. Yep. So actually, the loss rate is more intuitive to most of people, and right. But here I'm using gain because it has a nice multiplicative form, right? Along the routing path, the end-to-end gain actually is the product of this, because these can be treated as probabilities and the independent probabilities, right? So when you measure the end-to-end loss rate, it's a product of the individual loss rates, right? Okay, anyways, let me continue. So then we can characterize the aggregate input rate on any routing path L. Okay, it can be specified as a function of the end-to-end performance metrics in terms of the delay and the gain here, which can be calculated as the aggregation of the traffic sent by different content providers, I. So for each content provider I, here SIL denotes the number of users that the content provider serves using this route L. In practice, this number is determined first by the ISP's peering decisions that forms the topology and the routing path, so that this route will be available for this content provider. And then it also depends on the content provider's routing strategy, so that it decides to use that routing path. And then the second term, capital lambda I, denotes the average per user sending rate, which can be further expressed as the product of the first term is the probability, or you can imagine this as the fraction of users that choose to be active under the performance metric. In reality, you can imagine when the performance becomes worse and worse, a lot of users cannot tolerate the performance and they choose stop using it, right? But given that's the fraction of users who decide to use the service, and the lambda I is just the input rate or sending rate of the active users under the performance metrics. Any questions?
Yeah, can I ask one question? When you said that the number of users, do you recognize if the content provider is using a partial route or it has to use the full route to?
So in reality, there might be multiple routing paths available to the content provider. And it really depends on their routing strategy. Sometimes they might decide even to use load balancing strategies and dynamically change the routing, right? So that's why, so we have this parameter SIL, which might change based on the CP's routing strategy, but we're not explicitly modeling that. Here we're just assuming given any strategy, then this number of users will be fixed. Then here we further try to capture, given certain performance metric, among these users, what's the percentage of user that will choose to still use that service.
Okay.
But nevertheless, this is a little bit more into the details. It is okay if we need to fine-tune this model at this level again. But the high-level message is the aggregate throughput on any routing path can be characterized as a function of the performance along this route. Okay. So yeah, it's becoming a little bit involved, but the good news is that's pretty much what we need. So now we can pull everything all together and see the entire internet model. So we would like to characterize the steady state performance with respect to both the route level and the more detailed resource level in terms of the delay, D, the gain, G, and the corresponding input rates. So here we use phi to denote the steady state input rate in the system. So now we kind of answer one of the earlier question, what constitutes an equilibrium. Here, an equilibrium includes these 6 vectors, okay, and which satisfied a bunch of actually the following system of equations. Okay, so the first equations I have shown them in the previous slides that says along each route L, right, the aggregate input rate on that route can be characterized as a function of the end-to-end delay and gain, where the end-to-end performance can be calculated as the aggregations of the delay and the gains at the resource level. And then the remaining 2 equations, the third one says that these at each resource K, the delay and gain actually can be characterized as a function of the input rate phi K, right? And also depends on the capacity. This is something we have seen before as well. The only new equation is the last one. It says that we can also calculate the actual input rate to the individual resource as follows. It can be calculated as the aggregation of the input rate on different routes L where the resource K belongs to, because all these routes traverses through this resource K. Okay, so that's the input rate at the route level. But each such aggregate rate has to be kind of discounted, okay? Discounted by the gain factors of resources kappa. These resources kappa are preceding this resource K along these routes L, because it is possible that the packets got dropped before reaching this resource K along this routing path. Okay, so got it? So that's the only new piece of information. So this is the entire internet model under which we try to characterize the steady state performance. Okay, questions? So let's try to understand and answer the previous questions, right? How can we understand under the internet context, what is the commodity? So I briefly mentioned, we could understand it as the transport service that is created by these network resources and used by these traffic flows. So the demand side is the flows at the route level, and the supply actually is provided at the resource level. So eventually the 6 vectors constitute an equilibrium. But how can we understand and compare this one in the traditional context, right? In the traditional context, we know we can understand the actual quantity of the commodity produced and consumed and the corresponding price. And under our context, do we have something corresponding to the prices? And what is the quantity that has been produced and consumed? So I would say, as a comparison, we can do the following analogy. Okay, so actually what is produced and consumed actually is the standing rate, or maybe more specifically, combined with the gain factors, actually it is the throughput that has been generated and consumed by the upper layer application. And the performance metrics in terms of delay and the gain can be understood as the price, but more appropriately, maybe we can understand them as costs. And very often we call them congestion costs, right? So when it's more congested in terms of higher delay and low gain, right? And it's gonna discourage the demand from these applications. Right. So this is how we could make a comparison with the traditional kind of concept. So here I want to use a little bit different angle to show the system, but this is exactly the same thing I have shown in the previous slide. So here we put the delay and gain metrics and the input rate at the route level at the top, and the corresponding metrics at the resource level at the bottom. Okay, so we understand at the route level, the delay and the gain determines the input rate on the route. But at the resource level, it is the input rate that determines the delay and the gain. Okay? So one way to understand it from the economic point of view is that the delay and the gain at the route level influence the demand at the route level, right, in terms of input rate. But at resource level, it is the capacity, given the capacity of individual resources, okay, actually it supplies certain kind of, certain level of QoS in terms of delay and gain at each resource given any input rate 5K. So then how can we connect the demand and the supply in our context? Actually, it's through the aggregation of the delay and the gain, right? Delay is aggregated additively, and the gain is aggregated in a multiplicative way. So finally, both this input rate at the route level and the gain factors along partially in front of these resources jointly determines the input rate into the individual resources, as I mentioned before. So I want to discuss some results. So this work, we derived some general equilibrium results about the existence and uniqueness of equilibrium. And we characterize the uniqueness under special but important realistic scenarios. And we also did some sensitivity analysis. Okay. So for general analysis, although we have a quite complicated system of equations to deal with, eventually we found that as long as we can characterize the vector of input rate into the individual resources in the equilibrium, we can know everything in the equilibrium. So we can rewrite this complex system into a single equation, although this is expressed in the matrix form. Okay, so I'm not going to go into details, but it's not complicated. So simply, I'm just substitute the third equation, which is written as a function of the input rates 5K, into the second set of equations, and then further substitute this further back into the first equation. That makes our matrix function phi here. Okay. Then this product of the gains actually is constructed to be the matrix function H here. So the last equation can be rewritten as a simple equation as this. Okay, so this is a re-representation of the equilibrium. And then by using the Brouwer's fixed point theorem, we can show that there's always gonna be an equilibrium, okay, under very weak assumptions, as I mentioned. But in order to show the uniqueness of the equilibrium, we need more conditions. So based on another fixed point theorem called Kellogg's, we derived the condition as follows, which turns out to be quite complicated. Actually, I couldn't find a clear and intuitive physical meaning about this condition under the most general context. Then we further looked into some special scenario. First, we consider the case where none of the physical resources is shared by multiple routes. So in this case, each route can be treated as an independent linear topology of the network. So although this is an extremely simple case, it reflects certain scenarios where the content provider pays to the ISPs for dedicated and isolated resources for its own network traffic. Okay. So under this kind of scenario, we found that the uniqueness condition from here got greatly reduced into a much simpler condition written as follows. So here we need a new notation, which is a function TKD, which denotes the maximum throughput the system can accommodate under certain delay D. Okay? And it says that the uniqueness of equilibrium can be guaranteed if under any input rate lambda, on the left-hand side, actually, this is the throughput. Okay. Under the capacity and under the input rate, this is the throughput. And this throughput need to satisfy the condition that it equals the minimum of these two quantities. It has to be smaller or equal to than the input rate itself. This is a physical condition, right? Your throughput has to be less than or equal to your sending rate, lambda. But and also the other term is actually the maximum throughput the system can accommodate under the induced delay. So here is the induced delay when the input rate is lambda q. So actually this carries a physical meaning. It tells us that it gives a kind of so-called work conserving condition to restrict the active queue management or the control policies at the resources, so that they're not allowed to artificially drop the packet, right? So that they're not achieving the maximal throughput that can be accommodated, right? So we do need some kind of condition. If we can arbitrarily use any policies, then there might be multiple equilibria. But this shows as long as the policy and the control policy is work conserving, and then the uniqueness can be guaranteed. So we also did some sensitivity analysis, and through some theoretical results, we can draw some implications on the Netflix Comcast case to understand what really happened maybe. Some of these are results turns out to be not so counterintuitive. Okay, so first we can show that when the number of users of Netflix get increased, this is the parameter Sn, right? So we found that the end-to-end delay and gain will become worse, because when we need to serve more users, the system get congested. That's intuitive. So even Comcast provides isolated resource mu c for Netflix. That means even Comcast didn't intentionally throttle the traffic, that could be a natural consequence, as Comcast mentioned. And we can understand that even as Netflix increases its own capacities for a fixed number of users, okay? So even we assume the number of users didn't get increased, but because Netflix want to improve the quality, it unilaterally increases its own capacity. We can show that the aggregate traffic demand will increase, the input rate, the throughput will increase because the resource is expanded along the path. But you can imagine it's gonna make the downstream resource at the Comcast more congested, okay? So we can understand in the new equilibrium, we can show that although the aggregate or the total throughput will increase, but the sending rate of some users in theory could drop. right? In theory, this is because either the end-to-end delay or the drop rate might increase. That is possible, although it is not possible that both of them got decreased. Otherwise, the aggregate throughput will decrease in the new equilibrium. Right? So, so there's some more subtle results that we could derive from the analytical model, although it's a super simplified model in this case. And then further, we looked at another simplified scenario where we assume that the loss rate is almost 0. So this corresponds to the scenarios like when the applications use video streaming protocols like Dash that dynamically select the resolution for the videos so as to accommodate and adapt to the network congestion and drop rate, right? So under this kind of assumption, we can simply assume all the gains equals 1, so that we can further simplify the entire system so that the equilibrium becomes just 4 vectors. And the original 4 equations get reduced to the following four equations, where here R denotes a routing matrix. What's interesting here, or the major difference is this equation, where the input rates to the individual resources become simply the aggregation of the rates along individual routes that traverses through this resources, right? So, so among these 4 systems of equations, so now we have 2 of them becoming the linear systems. We used to have only 1 system, which is linear, okay, because the delays are additive. And then because of this, we can show for any lossless network under any kind of topology, the equilibrium actually is unique. This one took me quite a long time to derive, because intuitively I found this should be unique, but I couldn't find how to prove it. Then I thought maybe it's not true. Then I was trying to find some counterexample, but I couldn't. So eventually it got proved by some fundamental result called Farquhar's lemma, which actually really depends on these 2 linear systems. If one of them is nonlinear, then it's difficult to prove this result. Then probably it might not be true. So if we know the equilibrium is unique, then we can characterize the service QoS. The difficulty is that although we know the solution is kind of unique, we cannot explicitly write it out because it's an implicit solution of a system of equations. Okay, so but a nice thing is we can do some sensitivity analysis. We can understand how the equilibrium will change if some of the parameters of the system changes. For example, if an ISP expands its capacity or increase the user size got increased, right? And we can write down these changes in a closed form solution as this. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details, but if you're interested in the results, you can refer to the paper. Okay, so I think I'm going to close my talk by this slide. So I just want to discuss a little bit that how we can further extend this model in the bigger and the broader context. So that in the bigger context, we have a set of content providers, and they're trying to compete for end users in the different markets in different geographical regions in the world. Here M denotes the market share of different content providers in different regions. And this is indeed the internet e-commerce ecosystems, which is not modeled or analyzed in this work. Okay? But this whole system is built upon the internet transport infrastructure provided by the set of network providers, including the broadband ISPs, the content delivery networks, so on and so forth. They make capacity planning and deployment decisions in the different geographical regions to form the set of resources, right? This is the physical resources. And through the interactions between these network providers and with the content providers, they're gonna build interconnection links and forming different routing paths. And actually, this forms the entire topology of the internet. And based on their peering agreements, this forms the set of routing paths for different content providers to route their traffic. And for these content providers, given the kind of routes available to them, they're gonna distribute the traffic demand along these routing paths. This forms all these user sizes on different routes. This is the S, right? SIL denotes the number of users that are served on certain path. Then eventually, these users' demands in terms of TCP protocol, right, that determines the input rates, that will further affect the utilization, the delay, the drop rate on the individual resources, which turns out to determine the QoS for the application, although we need to aggregate these performance metrics at the resource level with respect to the routes. Right? So more details can be referred to this recent work. A more extended version will appear in the journal. So thank you so much.